It seemed like every year, Kyle looked forward to the snow. Living in North Georgia, he usually found his front yard full of the stuff sometime around Thanksgiving. Kyle fondly remembered the year a blizzard blew in before Halloween, and they had to trick-or-treat in the snow. Kyle's Batman costume quickly got upgraded with a puffy jacket and some ski boots with snowshoes as he became some obscure Batman that his mom had found on one of those little toy checklists he had pinned to his wall. Kyle loved the snow and would spend hours playing outside, making forts and having snowball fights with his friends. He only really came in if his parents made him, and only then until he warmed up enough to go back out. Kyle's favorite thing of all was building the large, lumpy snowmen that seemed to be all children could manage in their chunky gloves with their limited motor skills. After the first snow of the season, his yard always seemed to be full of snowmen. Sometimes Kyle stuck plastic guns or swords in their stick hands and decorated them with plastic dollar store armor to make them knights, or cast them in green clothes to make them soldiers. His dad used to take pictures of them and send them to magazines for local color pieces, and Kyle couldn't remember a year that at least one of them didn't make it somewhere in the paper. Many of them also hung around the house. When he grew up, Kyle still found that he loved the snow, but he never built snowmen. All the magic was sapped out of it when he was 10. Kyle, Carl, and Reggie were building an army of snowmen in the front yard when Terry and his friends came to call. Kyle's mom had been to Habitat for Humanity and brought home a big cardboard box full of plastic swords, helmets, and breastplates. There were probably about 24 sets in the box, a birthday party idea that someone had grown tired of, and Kyle and his friends were setting about making snow knights. They kept a set of armor apiece for themselves, and once the knights were built, they would have fun pretending to be warriors and knocking them down. They had just set them all up and were slinging on their gear when Terry came down the road with his 3 friends. Terry, Bobby, Mark, and Dale went to school with them, and they were all kind of bullies. Of the 4, Terry was the worst, and Kyle suspected that the others wouldn't be such big jerks if it hadn't been for Terry. Kyle and his friends had, in fact, partnered with the other 3 for school projects, and found them pretty friendly when they were separated from Terry. Terry was just a mean kid. He was that kid from your childhood you just remember being unpleasant. His dad was the town dog catcher, and Terry could regularly be seen tormenting some of the ones he brought home. There were rumors that he'd killed a few of them, and if his treatment of Kyle and his friends were any indication, they believed it. The 4 rode up on their bikes, taking advantage of the freshly plowed road and leering at the boys' game. "Ooh, what you doing, sissies? Gonna play some make-believe?" Terry said, using his mocking tone. Carl and Reggie looked a little embarrassed, aware that what they were doing was a little babyish. But Kyle stood his ground and refused to be turned aside from his fun. "None of your business, Terry. Why don't you take your bike and get the heck out of here?" Terry grinned. "Who's gonna stop me if I don't, Gaylord? You gonna tell your mommy?" Kyle brandished his little plastic sword and drew himself up with all the bearing a 10-year-old could manage. "Don't you dare take one step into my yard, Terry, or I swear to God I'll beat the crap out of you." Reggie and Carl gave him a sidelong look, clearly not wanting to fight with Terry or his friends. As Terry let his bike fall to the pavement and took those first steps onto the snowy lawn, Kyle saw Reggie break for the house. He was saying something about telling Kyle's mom, but Carl just stood there, unsure whether to join him or not. Terry and his friends crunched through the fresh powder, not unsure about much of anything. Unfortunately, Terry wasn't one of those bullies that couldn't back up his threats. He was about a head taller than Kyle, and outweighed him by about 50 pounds. It wasn't fat either. Terry's dad expected chores to be done, and work to be completed after school, and Terry had a lot of muscle to back up his threats. When Kyle swung his lame little sword at him, Terry stepped aside and swung at him with a closed fist. Kyle stumbled sloppily aside, and Terry smacked against one of the snowmen instead, sending a big chunk of its body crumbling to the ground. Terry sucked in air and shook his ungloved hand. The cold snow stinging his skin. Kyle could see little drops of red where he had struck a pine cone or a rock in the snow. Kyle swung down then, hitting Terry's arm with the plastic blade and eliciting a little yap of pain and surprise from the bully. Kyle took a defensive stance, now a little more sure of himself, but it was already too late. Terry turned and socked him right in the nose with a right hook. Kyle stumbled backwards, seeing stars as he fell, crunching into the snow as Terry towered over him. "Well, go on then. Beat the crap out of me." Kyle didn't immediately get up. His nose was bleeding, and his head was foggy. 3 Terrys shifted slowly before his eyes, and as they walked closer, he tried to lift his arms in defense. He lay in the snow, the moisture creeping into the seat of his snow pants, and suddenly felt a cold glob of something hit him in the face. He pulled a shaky hand up and realized that Terry had spit on him. Pathetic. Push some of these snowmen over, fellas. Let's teach him not to mess with us. His friends, who had been standing around looking uncomfortable, moved to do something that wouldn't get them in as much trouble as fighting. The snowman that had saved Kyle from Terry's first blow fell over wetly, the hard-packed snow needing very little convincing to rejoin the drift on the ground. Terry and his friends had pushed about 9 or 10 of the Snow Legion when Kyle heard his mom yelling from the porch. She was telling them to get the hell out of here as she crunched into the snow to see what had happened. Terry and his gang were away then, kicking over a few more snowmen in passing before jumping on their bikes and speeding away. Kyle's mom helped him up and brought the 3 boys inside so they could check Kyle's nose. After deciding that it wasn't broken, she gave them all hot cocoa as she tried to call Kyle's dad. She hung up with a disgusted head shake, telling Kyle to keep pinching his nose as he tried not to burn himself with the hot liquid. She said that she would have his father talk to Terry's father when he got home this evening, but all of them knew that that was a wasted effort. Terry's dad didn't care what his son did, and was the only person in town who was meaner than Terry. The snow had closed the schools early this year, so Terry would likely be back to stir up more trouble tomorrow. Kyle figured he'd just have to deal with it, but he wouldn't likely try to stand up to Terry again. Carl and Reggie made excuses to leave after that. Suddenly, the idea of playing in the yard didn't seem to appeal to them, and they left the armor behind as they walked back to their houses. Kyle told them that he'd see them tomorrow, but by the way they said they'd see, he didn't think he would. They'd been shamed and scared off by Terry, and Kyle doubted that they would be back to play until they all went back to school. He turned to see how many snowmen he had left, and was determined to replace the ones that Terry and his friends had knocked down. To his annoyance, Kyle found that only 4 had survived the attack, and one of them appeared to be the one that had bloodied Terry's knuckles. A chunk was missing, and the snow was stained a little pink where Terry had hit it, but it was still upright. Kyle packed the wound and gave the snowman a smile as he looked up into its lumpy features made out of rocks from the driveway. "Thanks, buddy. Guess you're my knight in shining armor, huh?" The snowman didn't respond, but Kyle hadn't really expected him to. He had rebuilt most of them when his dad got home, and he sighed as he looked at Kyle's face. Terry again? Terry had been picking on the kids who lived in the neighborhood since he was old enough to walk, and if you looked like someone had beaten the crap out of you, then it was probably Terry's doing. His dad said that he'd call Mr. Maslow, the roads being a little too rough to drive right now, and Kyle thanked him before returning to repairing his snow army as Dad went in to make the call. By the time the sun set, Kyle had about 30 snow knights ready for the battle the next day, and couldn't wait for tomorrow morning. When he came inside, he could hear his dad trying to talk to Terry's dad, and he winced as he pulled the phone away in the face of the yelling on the other end. Kyle took his place at the table, and a few minutes later, his dad joined them, still grumbling about the rude neighbors. His mom smiled at him and kissed his dad on the forehead, doling out a little extra roast for dealing with that old dragon. When Kyle went to bed that night, the snow flurries were falling outside the window, and the knowledge that tomorrow would be another snowy day to play in the fresh powder made him eager for the dawn. Kyle was up bright and early the next day to play in the snow. The armored snowmen were enemy soldiers, their leader wearing a solid black breastplate and sporting a stick mustache. All the snowmen, except for the one that had taken a punch for him yesterday, Kyle had decided that the snowman would assist him in battle, and they cut the other Snow Knights to pieces as they saved the Snow Prince from their evil leader. The Snow Knight didn't really help, of course. He watched Kyle's back as he hacked and slashed through the opposition, his own sword held firmly in hand. Kyle watched them fall to pieces with relish, his face red as his breath steamed in the cold air. Kyle was having too much fun to think about Terry that morning, and the bully didn't poke his head up to bother him until after lunch. Kyle had come outside after soup and sandwiches to find a new army of snowmen had been erected to stand against him and his friend. Kyle smiled, confused, but more pleasantly surprised than anything. He didn't question the appearance of the new snowmen. Maybe his dad had come home and decided to leave a little surprise for him. Kyle set about building an extra large snowman to be their evil leader, making him a set of bulbous arms and giving him some missing teeth from the driveway gravel. He was just carving the snow helmet with the tip of his sword, his breastplate looking large and sturdy with the sticks he'd added, when he heard the sound of rubber on concrete. Kyle tried to ignore it. Maybe it wasn't the sound of Terry's Roadmaster as it turned the corner, but all illusions were shattered a moment later when Kyle heard the boy's standard greeting. "Hey, you gay lord, playing in the snow again?" he said in a fake baby talk way he liked to use. Kyle heard his friends laugh behind him as he said it, but he didn't turn around. If Terry wanted to beat him up, he'd have to do it in his yard and come trespassing. "What do you want, Terry?" Kyle asked, his nose still sore from the day before. "Just thought you'd like to know I got grounded for punching you in your stupid face yesterday." That surprised Kyle. He hadn't expected Terry's dad to do anything more than yell at him. The fact that he'd taken the time to tell Terry he was grounded was sort of refreshing. Clearly it hadn't worked, but hey, it was progress. "Good to know. So why are you here?" "We're looking for Dale," Bobby said, his voice sounding a little upset, despite Terry's angry look. "His mom said he never came home yesterday, and we were thinking—" "No, I haven't seen him either," Kyle assured him. "If I do, though, I'll point him home." "Whatever," Terry scoffed, and the three of them rode off on their bikes, cutting noisily up the snowy road. Kyle went back to building his Snow Knights, oblivious to the context of what was happening around him. That was how it had began. For the next week, Kyle played pretend in the yard. He saw the snowmen rise and fall, but the one that had pricked Terry remained standing. He was the colonel of the boy's army, the knight captain of his crusaders, the king of the kingdom, and any other leader Kyle needed. This didn't seem weird to Kyle at the time. He was just a kid and figured the snowman would be gone once the snow melted. They played every day, Carl and Reggie seeming to have lost their appetite for the snow, which was fine as long as Kyle didn't think about it. Who needed them anyway? Kyle had friends at hand anytime he built them. They searched for Dale for quite a while. His parents were worried that he'd been picked up by some kind of sex pervert or something. They never found his bike either, and the longer he remained missing, the more the police figured they would find him when the snow melted. Kyle's dad figured that he'd likely taken one of the curves on the mountain a little too sharply and slid under the guardrail. If Terry didn't push him off the cliff somewhere, he added, earning a smack from Kyle's mom and a quick glance at their son. Kyle agreed, but he pretended not to have heard since it seemed his mother didn't want him to get ideas. When Kyle went out the next day, he was surprised to see that the snowman was gone. It wasn't terribly upsetting. Snowmen melted, but Kyle had become quite attached to the fella. He had left the snow soldiers in the yard, guns and helmets dotting them, and it seemed like only the old snowman was gone. Kyle started to rebuild him, but decided instead to go see his friends. Carl had called to ask if he wanted to come play Super Nintendo at his house, and Kyle thought it might be nice to do something a little different. As he rode his bike, he rubbed his hands as the wind cut across him. Carl lived a little higher up on the mountain than he did, and as he passed the houses along the way, he couldn't help but notice the undisturbed snow in their yards. Kyle couldn't understand how anyone, adult or child, could look at all that snow and not feel moved to be out in it. As they cruised past Bobby's house, however, he could see that his yard had sprouted a couple of snowmen. Kyle wondered why he had helped Terry give him so much flack if he was fond of snowman building too, but he couldn't help but notice that Bobby's snowmen looked a little different. They were arrayed outside the house's windows, almost like they were peeking in, and it was a little spooky looking. Kyle put on a burst of speed, feeling a little weird about seeing it. like it was him peeking in instead of a bunch of snowmen. He pulled up in front of Carl's house and saw that Reggie's bike was already there. The two were sitting in his bedroom playing Goof Troop on the Super NES, and they waved at Kyle as he came in. Carl's dad was the superintendent for the school system in the area, and Carl had all kinds of cool stuff at his house. Reggie said he'd swap with Kyle when he died, and the three boys sat around and thwarted the efforts of Pirate Pete as they made their way through the levels. "Has Terry been bothering you lately?" Reggie asked, kicking a block into one of the fat pirates as he blocked their path. "Not really. I think his dad got mad when my dad called," Kyle said, spinning a Rubik's Cube in his hand half-heartedly. "Did you hear about Dale?" Carl asked quietly, as if he was afraid to talk too loudly about it. "Just that he's missing. Dad said they found his bike in a snowdrift. Said something had hit it hard enough to dent the front wheel." Did they find Dale?" Kyle asked, curious as to why he hadn't heard about the boy being found. "Nope, he's still missing. Sheriff Draper came to check the area, though. They think he might have fallen off when he hit whatever he hit. Dad thinks he might have been snatched." Kyle thought about this as they played, and as the sun started going down, he opted to head out before it got too dark. Carl's mom asked if he'd like to stay for dinner, but Kyle said that he had to get home or his mother would worry. He shivered as he climbed onto his bike, taking off as the cold air gave him a burst of speed. As he drove past Bobby's house, he saw that the snowmen were gone, and he wondered if Bobby had been the one to build them or not. When he pulled up in his own yard, Kyle was surprised to see that his snowman was back, right in the same spot it had been before. He was still wearing the breastplate that Kyle had put on him in the first place, but someone had replaced his plastic sword with a machete. His dad was probably having a goof. He had drawn his smile a little creepier than Kyle remembered it too, and as he walked up, he patted the snowman on the shoulder. "Good to have you back, partner." The body was rounder than it had ever been, but not quite round enough to hide something gray in the middle. Kyle pushed away a bit of snow and found a big rock in the center of the snowman's body. Kyle thought that was weird, but maybe Dad was trying to stop Terry and his friends from wrecking him up again. He went inside as the moon cast the yard in diamonds, but that night he had a terrible dream about his friend. He was sitting in the yard, flanked by a pair of snowmen who seemed to be leaking red stuff. Kyle wasn't sure if it was blood, but he was pretty sure it wasn't strawberry jelly. They were looking through his window, their coal eyes seeming very expressive, and when Kyle turned away, he could see their shadows growing tall on the wall. He peeked under the covers, looking through a slit in his comforter, and could see the heads of the two snowmen melting to reveal a pair of skulls with empty eye sockets. Kyle woke up with a start, but found his window empty. The next day, Kyle was playing in the yard when he heard Terry shout at him from the road. "Stay the hell out of my yard, Gaylord!" Kyle jumped and turned to look at him, startled by the sudden appearance. He hadn't heard the bike at all, and Terry usually came in loudly. He was alone today, none of his cronies having made the trip, and Kyle thought back to Bobby's yard the day before. Had he decided not to play with Terry after his behavior? Kyle doubted it, but it was possible. "What are you talking about?" Kyle asked, legitimately confused. He'd been here all morning, building snow knights for another battle, and his hands were wet and wrinkly under his gloves. He'd been planning on making another army to conquer, having found a plastic axe in his toy chest, and he was going to pretend to be Conan as he conquered the savage army. He was almost finished with a giant fella, the leader of this band of cannibals, when Terry had startled him. "Stop building snowmen in my yard," Terry repeated, letting his bike fall to the icy pavement as he took a step towards Kyle. "I know it's you. You're the only baby stupid enough to build these things. If I wake up one more night to find them peeking in my window, I'm going to pound you," he said, shaking his fist at Kyle. He didn't seem to want to step into his yard, though, and the threat was sort of lame. Kyle ignored him, continuing to build his snow giant, and Terry eventually left. That night, his dad told him that Bobby had gone missing too. "Strangest thing," he said, pouring gravy on his roast. "His folks said he went to take the trash out the day before and just never came back. They thought he'd gone to see Terry or Mark, but they started hunting for him and he didn't come back. The sheriff's pretty worried about it. The people are gonna want answers soon, and we're only a 3-officer town. There's no footprints either. Odd, since there's been no snow today. but there were some strange marks they'd thought might be tire tracks. Poor kid. Hopefully they find him. Kyle didn't eat much, wondering if he'd seen the vehicle that had taken Bobby. He didn't think he'd seen any cars that day, none that high up the mountain, and he hadn't passed any strange vehicles yesterday on his way back from Carl's house. He thought again about the snowman, but put it out of his head. Snowmen couldn't hurt anybody, they were just snow. The next day, Kyle saw a familiar truck pulling into the driveway. He was pulling his boots on, getting ready to go play after lunch, but he went back inside as a haggard bear of a man climbed out and walked towards the house. His dad was getting ready for work, the shifts having changed a little when the second kid went missing, and as Kyle came blundering into the kitchen, he narrowed his eyes at the door. He answered the angry knock and came eye to eye with Terry's father, Herschel Maslow. Herschel looked angry, angrier than Kyle had ever seen him. He staggered a little, likely drunk, but his eyes were bloodshot and angry. As the town dog catcher, he was supposed to stay sober while on the job, but that hardly seemed to matter to him. The mayor, his first cousin, usually smoothed over any problems he found with the police, but Herschel was a bomb just waiting to go off. He steadied himself against the doorframe before slurring out, "Keep your stupid brat off my property. I'm tired of hearing my boy whine about these damn snowmen." His dad looked at Kyle, but Kyle just shook his head. "Kyle, have you left the yard today?" Kyle shook his head again, but Herschel scoffed. "He's lying. I found 5 of them snowmen in my yard this morning. They just keep popping up, and Terry don't make 'em. Tell your kid to stay out of my yard, cop, else I'll shoot him as a trespasser next I see him." His dad looked like he meant to say more to Herschel, but the man stumbled off then, climbing into his truck as Kyle and his dad watched him go. Drunk bastard. Should pull him over right now. He looked down at Kyle for a moment before growling, "Make sure you stay away from the Maslow house, kiddo. He's a mean old drunk, but I think enough kids have gone missing so far without you getting shot for riding your bike." Kyle said he would, not intending to go anywhere close to that farm. The snowman was gone again when he came out to play, and Kyle wondered if Mr. Maslow had knocked him over. Kyle played in the snow for the rest of the afternoon, and as the sun began to sink towards dark, he heard a familiar squeal of tires. He started to head inside, not really wanting to be harassed by Terry today, but when someone called to him, he saw that it was Mark instead of the unpleasant young man. He pulled up in the yard, out of breath, sweat standing out on his forehead. "Hey, Kyle," he said, looking around fretfully. "Still, playing in the snow, huh?" Kyle nodded, looking behind him as though he expected to see Terry coming up on his bike, too. Could I ask a favor?" he said, looking behind him as if he thought something was following him. "I guess," Kyle said, looking to see what was chasing him. Terry's dad wasn't home, and Terry wouldn't ride with me to my house. Would you..." He looked torn, as if asking would make him feel weak. "Could you ride with me to my house? I hate to ask, but I feel kind of nervous about riding alone." Kyle thought about telling him to buzz off, but Mark seemed really shaken. He thought about it and figured that maybe Mark wouldn't mess with him if he owed him a favor. Besides, he could always ask Carl's mom if she could give him a ride, their house being just a few houses from Mark's. She would gladly drive him home, it being close to dark, and Kyle nodded, sticking his head in to tell his mom he was going to ride up to Carl's for a second. "Okay," he said, hopping on his own bike, "but let's be quick. It's almost dark." As the two took off, Mark seemed even more rattled than before. He kept looking behind them as they rode, and Kyle couldn't help but look as well. As the shadows gathered on the mountain, Kyle thought he heard something crunching in the snow behind them. He never got a good look at it, though. It moved quickly through the trees, its form hunched as it churned up the snow. Mark's teeth clicked together a little as he put on a burst of speed. "Something's following us," Kyle whispered, matching his speed. Mark didn't say anything. The two zipped up the mountain, and the edge yawned hugely beside them. This was the precipice, one of the edges that could send you tumbling off the side if you weren't careful, and the icy road made him wonder if he could stop in time if it came to it. It shrank away suddenly, and a few houses dotted the side, their windows lit with soft inner light. Kyle could still see the shadows following them, the three figures keeping up with them quickly, and when they rounded the next bend, Kyle stopped in confusion. It was his snowman, the one with the black breastplate, but the other two he didn't seem to recognize. They stood in the road, blocking the path, and the kids would be forced to ride between them to get farther up. Kyle had few qualms about moving between them, but Mark started to shake and mumble as he watched the three. No, not again. I'm not going out like that. Not like Bobby. He turned into the trees to their left and plunged in like a frightened deer. Kyle started to ask him what was wrong, but that's when he heard something grind against the pavement in front of him. It sounded like ice under someone's tires, and he turned back in time to see that the snowmen were gone. In the dying light, he thought he saw them disappear into the trees, and without thinking, Kyle plunged in after Mark. The boy's trail was easy to follow. The broken branches and tire tracks led him into the snow-covered woods. It was good that he had a trail to follow, otherwise he would have joined Mark at the bottom of the small holler. He had gone right over the edge in his haste, and he and his bike were at the bottom, lying in a heap. Kyle came down carefully, trying not to join him at the bottom, but when he got to him, he could tell the boy's arm was broken. "Can you move?" Kyle whispered, not sure why he was trying to be quiet. Mark groaned, sitting up as he hissed and pulled his arm in close. Around the holler, Kyle could hear something moving roughly through the snow. It churned it up, moving lumpily through the shadows, and as the boys huddled in the cup of the valley, the setting sun left them in twilight. Kyle tried to get an arm under him, wanting to help Mark out of the dell, but the boy pulled away, shaking his head as he touched his chest. "I think I broke something in the fall. My chest is on fire. My arm hurts too much." Kyle licked his lips, unable to figure out what to do. "What did you mean you weren't going out like Bobby?" he asked, looking around at the hunkered shadows that peeked in on them. "Bobby called me the day before he disappeared," he groaned, sitting down in the snow and scrunching his eyes shut. "He said he'd been seeing snowmen hanging around his house and was a little scared. We thought you were doing it, but the snowmen seemed to be moving, and he begged me to come over and make sure he wasn't going crazy. I would have too, but my mom didn't want me going out so close to dark. Then Bobby was gone." Kyle couldn't imagine that the snowmen were actually snatching kids, but the longer he watched them shuffle around the outside of the holler, the more he began to believe that something was going on. "If I can't get you out, then I'll go get you help," Kyle said, Mark groaning in protest almost at once. "Carl's house is right around the bend. If I can make it there quick, I can get you some help. I'll be right back. Just fend them off till then." It was a bad plan, but Kyle didn't really know what else to do. They would get both of them otherwise, and as Mark tried to stop him from going, he took off up the side of the bowl at a run. He expected roots to snag his feet or limbs to grab him as he ran, but nothing stood in his path. He kind of thought that the thing that had stalked them would come after him, but they never seemed to come after him. His fear of them seemed to be his only enemy, and as the trees pressed in around him, the sun plunged him into near total darkness. The silvery moon overhead provided little in the way of light, and as he ran, Kyle felt himself becoming hopelessly lost. It should have been easy to find his way out of the woods. They weren't very large, but it wasn't until Kyle saw a jumble of confusing lights that he finally found his way out of the trees. It was the bubble lights on his dad's police cruiser, and when he saw him, he pulled him in close, and Kyle could feel the tears as they soaked into his shoulders. "I thought someone had gotten you. I thought for sure I'd never see you again." Kyle tried to tell him what had happened, but his dad was squeezing him too tightly for much beyond a few squeaks. When he finally stopped squeezing him, Kyle told him about Mark and the shapes in the woods. "Get in the car," he said, putting Kyle in the back seat as he got on the radio and called for help. He clearly didn't believe that the snowmen had done this, but he believed that something was out there, and that it intended to take children. Despite the weather, 3 other squad cars soon came flashing up the mountain, and the sheriff had his dog in the back seat. "Stay here," his dad said. "You'll be safe in the back. We're going to see if we can find Mark." Kyle pushed his face against the window, watching them disappear into the trees. As he watched, his adrenaline spiking, he felt his eyes getting heavier and heavier. He fell asleep with his head against the door, and when the car rumbled to life sometime later, Kyle shook awake. His dad was driving, and another car was behind him as they went down the mountain. "Where are we going?" Kyle asked. His dad started as he seemed to realize that his son was still in the back seat. He seemed to be looking for the words, "gonna take the murderer into custody." Kyle felt his blood run cold. Murderer? Had Mark been killed too? What did his dad mean? As they drove down the mountain, passing their own house, Kyle asked if they had found Mark. "No," he said, strangely solemn, "but we found drag marks. They went all the way down to, well," he seemed not to want to tell Kyle, but as they pulled into the Maslow property, he didn't have a lot of choice. "We found him inside a snowman." Kyle heard someone shout and saw a very puffy-eyed Mr. Maslow as he was led away from his home in handcuffs. The sheriff and Deputy Frank were having trouble with him, but they were half tugging, half carrying him as he went towards the deputy's car, the sheriff's dog baying wildly in the back of his cruiser. Terry was being led away by Deputy Martin, and though uncuffed, he looked scared. As they pulled away, the sheriff told Kyle's dad to wait for the coroner so someone could get the bodies. Kyle's dad keyed up the mic and said that he would. They were inside the snowmen. There were 4 of them, one of them having only a rock inside. We don't know if it was Terry or Herschel, but one of them built those snowmen around those kids' bodies. I'm just glad we found you in time." His dad started to get out, but Kyle needed him to answer the question. "What did the one with the rock in him look like?" His dad, thinking he understood, nodded. "It was wearing that black breastplate your snowman in the front yard was wearing. I think he might have been saving that one for you, but I'm not sure." The coroner pulled up then, and Dad climbed out. Kyle looked out the window, seeing the 3 destroyed snowmen, but he felt the gravel eyes of the 4th as it took him in. Kyle never forgot that winter. Mr. Maslow was sent to prison for murder, his cousin unable to smooth this over. Terry went to stay with relatives and was never seen on the mountain again. The house was put up for sale, but no one seemed to want it. When the snow caved the roof in 3 years later, they just destroyed it, and the property was still empty to Kyle's knowledge. Kyle moved to Boston after college, leaving behind the mountains and the harsh winters. He still enjoyed the snow, loving the way it piled in the yard as it fell, but he never played in it. Sometimes he thought he saw a battered old snowman in a black breastplate standing watch in his yard, but he never caught more than a glimpse of it. Kyle never thought much of it. Surely it couldn't be the same one. That had been years and years ago, and snowmen just didn't last that long. He went right on thinking that, until a coworker who fancied himself a bit of a bully suddenly went missing. They found him in a snowdrift during spring, and Kyle always wondered if he was to blame for the man's death. When the pandemic started, Kyle was glad to be able to work from home. He didn't want to risk another life at the hands of his white knight. Good evening, everyone. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining me for tonight's story. If you enjoyed tonight's story and you haven't already, why not go ahead and subscribe? Maybe hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of the spooky things that we do here. While you're here, maybe go ahead and give that video a like and drop a comment. I like it when people comment. If you're not too spooked and you think you might can handle a little more, why not go ahead and click on one of those other videos that's about to pop up. Maybe check out one of our playlists. There's quite a few. If you'd like to support the channel more monetarily, I'd suggest maybe you go pick up a copy of my latest book. There's a link below. Or maybe head on over to Patreon. I have quite a few tiers. I'm sure there's one that'll suit you best. Speaking of Patreon, let's go ahead and thank our patrons, shall we? Thanks to Janet for being our Spooky Skeleton tier contributor. And thanks to Winters, Xaronan, Emily Coltsfoot, Martha, Marianne Schuler, Jennifer Damron, and Tyler Parker for being our Ghostly Reader tier contributors. Thanks, guys. We just couldn't do the show without you. If you're a fan of my books, I always recommend go ahead and join that Ghostly Reader tier $10 a month, and it also gets you a book anytime I write one, which is around twice a year usually. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.